Hello, and welcome to the Catholic Passage Podcast. My name is Aaron Lorch, and I'm today's host. This podcast aims to pursue the truth, an authentic Catholic life, a deep integration of faith and reason, and a joyful community of families raising the next generation of the Catholic faithful. Today's guest is Father Travis Crotty, who is the current director of Vocations for the Diocese of Sioux City, Iowa, as well as chaplain at Bishop Heelan High School in Sioux City. He also happens to have a podcast of his own with our recent guest, Father Shane Demon, called Outcast Catholic. I'm really excited to share our dialogue through this episode where Father Travis and I discuss his role and take on vocations, his own vocational story to the priesthood, the current dynamics of the faithful community, and of course so much more. We hope you enjoy our conversation and that it might bless you in some way. All right, here we go. Father Travis Crotty, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
Yeah, so I'd like to kind of start this off by a little backstory. You know, I think a lot of our listeners already know who you are. Some of them might not know you, but I think all of us kind of would like to hear the backstory. So kind of go back to where you're originally from. What was it like growing up? Kind of what was the story as you discerned the priesthood and kind of led to where you are right now?
Of course, yeah. My name is Father Travis Crotty. I am from a tiny town in northwest Iowa called Varina with a V. It's in between Newell and Fonda. It's kind of smack dab in the middle of our diocese in northwest Iowa. I joke sometimes. My uncle was the mayor when I was in high school. My grandpa was the mayor before I was born. But I'm told that priests aren't supposed to hold public office, so I gave up the dream and I became a priest instead of the mayor of Varina. However, I've told that story, and I guess at one point the pastor in Cherokee in our diocese, a smaller town, there was no one to be the mayor, so he stepped up. So apparently there's a loophole. So maybe possibly someday I can still be the mayor of Varina. Varina is like 65 people. That's what makes it funny.
Yeah.
I gave up the dream. So I grew up in town, which is kind of shocking in that area. Like I wasn't actually a farm kid. I was a town kid.
Yeah, the outlier.
But I was an outcast, if you will, in Varina. So, but then like classic, like the first, like there's like, it's 6 streets in a church. Right. Yeah. And an old grain elevator that was hit by a tornado that's still sitting there 12 years later from the tornado, you know?
Yep.
So I grew up in town, but my uncle like farmed like these little like plots on the very edge of town. So, I mean, it was as close to, you know, farm life as possible. But my parents both worked in Storm Lake, grew up there, and I went to Newell Fonda high school. I went to the Catholic grade school in Fonda, and it closed when I was in 5th grade. And then I went to the public high school. So I kind of had the taste of both Catholic education, public high school education. And then right after high school, and I'll you know, step into the kind of the discernment, the vocation story, as they say, but in high school, through a number of things, I started to think about the priesthood kind of seemingly out of nowhere. Grew up in a Catholic family. We kind of did the classic, I think, Mass every Sunday. We prayed before meals and we prayed before bed.
Yeah. Standard.
And it was good. It wasn't bad. I was, I'm the oldest grandchild on both sides, my mom and my dad's side. My mom's the oldest, my dad's the middle. So I have a lot of younger cousins, but I actually had my great-grandparents, most of them kind of alive most of my childhood. So I would stay with my great-grandma outside of Varina.
Okay.
Very devout woman. We'd go to the, a funny story, we'd go to the cemetery, you know, to decorate the different graves with flowers. I'd eventually end up mowing that cemetery in high school, of course, you know. Of course. And it's beautiful. My great-great-grandparents are buried in that cemetery that I mowed. So, I mean, my family has been in this little Irish village in Varina for a long time. Really faithful people. At one point, I remember I was probably like 4, and I asked, there's a big crucifix where the old church used to be at the cemetery, and then in like 1900, they moved the church to the railroad where the new town was established. And I asked my great-grandma who put Jesus on the cross. She said, bad men. And I had like a, you know, I'm a little kid. I had like a croquet mallet that I guess I brought from her house, goofing around, knocking, you know, like weeds and stuff.
Yeah.
I was running around the cemetery saying that I was trying to find the bad men who put Jesus on the cross. Yeah. So I guess I'm still trying to, you know, find the bad man out there, you know, bring him back to the Lord. So I grew up in that small town. And then I actually went to seminary right after high school, which is uncommon today, I'd say.
Yeah, I was going to say.
what they call a lifer. So I was in 4 years of college seminary. I went to Conception Seminary College in Northwest Missouri. I got on Highway 71 for those in Northwest Iowa who know it, and I drove south for 4 hours on a 55-mile-per-hour blacktop.
And why was it there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So bishops, this is kind of interesting. So I think a lot of folks who might know non-Catholic Protestants, Christians who go to seminary, that's usually more of like a freelance experience.
Yes.
Like you decide you want to go to a Bible college, you might go to like Moody Bible College in Chicago. You get your undergrad in kind of studying the scriptures, maybe a little theology, and then you might go to grad school, but then you kind of just put yourself out there. And when any number of kind of Bible churches are looking for a pastor,
Okay, I'm going to live there.
yep, and they might hire you and they bring you in. What's different, what's helpful in a certain way with Catholic priest is that the entire time from when you apply to seminary to when you eventually are ordained, you're sponsored by a diocese. There's no kind of freelance.
You're being guided.
You're being guided. Yep. So I applied to seminary when I was in high school. I was accepted. I went to undergrad, and then the choice of seminary is up to the bishop. So he's the one who sends you. The vocations director is the one who's kind of your liaison between you and the bishop, and then the bishop and the seminary as well. So we'd had a standing relationship with Conception. It's a Benedictine monastery. They'd been there for a long time. A lot of men had gone there. I went there for college seminary, and then I went to Denver for grad school. So I was 4 years in college seminary, got a degree in philosophy. I thought I was going to be in Denver for 5 years. I went to Denver. They had this kind of spirituality year, kind of this retreat year. And in the middle of that year, Father Shane, who was my vocation director at the time, he called me up and he said, "Hey, I'd like to see how you're doing." I had just gone on a poverty immersion. I spent a month living at a homeless shelter in Omaha. So I was going to tell him about that. I was his first guy. He had just become vocation director. I was his first guy to go through this program.
Yeah.
I talked to him for a half an hour, and then he gets to a point. He said, "Travis, have you ever thought about going to a different seminary?" I'm like, no. I'm in my first semester of the one place that has the extra year, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So he really wanted to send guys to Kenrick in St. Louis. So the next year, I was the guinea pig with two new men who went to Kenrick in St. Louis. So then I went to grad school in St. Louis. So I was Missouri for 4 years, Denver for 1, Missouri for 4 more years.
Yeah.
So I know it well. Yeah.
And you have it kind of unique that way where I would say most priests, would you say traditionally are just going to one place or not necessarily?
Most of the time. So certain dioceses that have their own in-house seminary, so like St. Louis men, for example,
Sure.
They have a college seminary. They also have a grad school. Those men will go to their own seminary. Cleveland would be another example, St. Paul, Chicago, these places.
Yeah.
Other dioceses, most of the dioceses in the U.S. that don't have a seminary, it just depends on what their affiliation is and where the guys kind of go. So I would say a lot of guys, if they go to college seminary like I did, they'll end up going to 2. Unique that I went to 3. Yeah.
But I mean, I'm sure that you look at it as a rich experience overall that way, right?
It was, yeah. I'm grateful I got the experience. Denver is very different than the Midwest insofar as culturally it's much more secular. But the church, from like 93 when John Paul II came for World Youth Day, it has this kind of rich intensity for evangelization. The Augustine Institute is there.
Oh, yeah.
Over the years, the archbishops have brought in numbers of kind of lay movements, religious orders. So it's like the church is alive, and that was exciting. And I'm glad I experienced that. And then St. Louis is like the quintessential Midwest city.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it felt so much more like home. It felt like a bunch of small towns just shoved together. So I appreciated the kind of like Midwest culture that was there. The culture was so different in the kind of the Mountain West region.
Yeah.
Culture is so much more similar in St. Louis. And what I'm so grateful for is that the close friends that I made in that seminary are guys from Nebraska, Missouri, and Illinois, rather than some of my friends have really close friends from Montana, Arizona, California, and it's harder to get together with those guys. So it's nice for me that it's like I hop on Interstate 29 and I can go see my buddies in Omaha, Kansas City, head over to St. Louis.
Yeah, it's
so
all
that's
that
kind
Midwest.
of nice.
Yeah. That's right. Well, and you said vocation director, and
yes.
if people don't know already, you've taken over Father Shane's job.
Yes.
For people that don't know, what is a vocation director? What does that mean? What is your role? What are you doing?
Well, yeah, so I can finish the kind of trajectory of what happened. So I was ordained in 2020, which folks remember a certain pandemic was happening then.
Yeah.
So it was, getting close when recording this. It was St. Patrick's Day of 2020, March of 2020, when I left the seminary in St. Louis and I drove 8 hours back to Sioux City. I lived at our cathedral, finished grad school via Zoom and everything else for 3 months. I was ordained June 6th of 2020, and that was still within that kind of shutdown era.
Oh, yeah.
So I had my immediate family. I had my parents, my brothers, stepbrother, stepsister. They're kind of, there was a spouse, there was, a couple kids, but like it was just my family, my grandparents. There was a choir, a couple seminarians who served, and that was it. My first mass the next day had like 5 people at it.
Yeah.
It was very odd, very, very odd.
Yeah.
My ordination was actually they decided to have it on TV. So it was on like KTIV Channel 4. It was wild. There's a lot of.
Compare it to like the people that tried to get married during COVID.
Yes.
The same way.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And thankfully, what was beautiful was the gift of the priest was the gift of the priest that I've been preparing for 9 years. So what was so exciting those first months, it's like everything was still new. I'm celebrating the sacraments for the first time. It was still so joyful.
Yeah.
Really, it wasn't until like the next year when I started going to my friends' ordinations and their parties that I'm like, oh man. I missed out on these awesome times. Yeah. So I was ordained in 2020 and my first assignment was in Lamar's, Iowa, home of Blue Bunny ice cream, as many people know. I loved it. I was there for 2 years. I was the parochial vicar. People don't often know that term. That's just the assistant pastor, Catholic terminology, right?
Or associate pastor.
Associate pastor, right? So I was the parochial vicar with my pastor there for 2 years, and I was the chaplain of the K through 12 school that's right next door. Small town. I drove a moped around town.
Nice.
It was a good time. And then when Father Shane was asked to become the vice rector at Kenrick in St. Louis, my alma mater, I was asked by the bishop to become vocation director.
Sure. So
vocation director, I think the easiest way people will see it is kind of a recruiter or a promoter. I think unfortunately that's not the case. That's not what we want it to be, right?
Yeah.
The idea of vocational discernment is not like the Marines, right?
Yeah. Or like a salesman either.
Exactly. And that gets really lifeless after a time of just trying to do that. But really my job, my goal, my work is to accompany young men as they discern the priesthood through that application process up until they go to seminary.
I feel like you're more supportive than you are just bringing in and then you're done.
Right. So a lot of the work when I kind of am running around the diocese, so I'm also the chaplain of a high school in Sioux City at Bishop Heelan. I'm also the weekend chaplain at Briar Cliff at the college. But then also I kind of have the freedom to travel around and I cover masses. So when I've been up to the lakes before and covered mass at St. Joe's in Milford, St. Mary's in Spirit Lake, I can help brother priests because I'm not kind of locked into a parish.
That's right.
I also live at our cathedral in downtown Sioux City. I can speak Spanish, so I often cover masses there as well. Part of that is just I get around quite a bit. I help out with a lot of confirmation retreats. A lot of it is the kind of like, well, you're a farmer, There's a lot of work that goes into preparing the ground. There's a lot of work that goes into picking the right seed. There's a lot of work that goes into kind of like the cultivation of it. And then you let it grow, right? Yeah. The hope then, right, as St. Paul said, is that like, one plants a seed, one waters, one kind of cultivates, and then it's God who kind of prepares the growth. That's the hope that's happening. The hope is happening.
To support and monitor, but it's really up to God beyond that.
Absolutely. And like really that the real planting of the seeds of vocations happen in the family, happen in the life of a parish. There's nothing magic of like you go on a vocations weekend retreat and boom. But it's interesting how those seeds that have been planted, different things kind of spark that growth, which is kind of exciting. Yeah. So to be kind of a part of that. So I do a lot of things, help out with a lot of confirmation retreats, offer a lot of different kind of preaching and teaching opportunities, things like that. But yeah, mainly it's helping men discern and prepare to priesthood. So I've been able to work with 2 men last year who joined the seminary, working with a couple guys this year. It's exciting. It's exciting because in some ways it makes sense when you kind of put it on paper. Okay, this is but where the real vocational discernment comes, I mean, there's mystery there, right? There's this relationship of the man with God.
That's right.
And how that develops. And I get kind of invited into that. I get invited to kind of walk with the man through that.
What a blessing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's beautiful. It's different. It's not the kind of like consistency of parish life that I think most people see a priest living. So
do you think there's a necessity to have like a young priest like yourself in that role for multiple reasons? One, just the energy and the zeal, I'll say, to go about what you just said, like, because it's not consistency. And some maybe older priests might stereotypically want that. And then there's also just relating to the younger people. I don't know.
Yeah, there's kind of I've seen 2 schools take place. There's kind of the ideas where the vocation director should be a young guy to connect with young people. But then there's also a question of like a priest who's kind of a seasoned priest. He's been living this life for a while. It's more established. And he's kind of has like a more of a fatherly role,
Yeah.
That's a little different. It's been interesting. It's like I'm obviously closer in age to the men that I'm working with than most guys. I'm 30 years old. So it's like it's helpful because I understand the life that they're living. I understand the culture that we're both kind of coming from, right? Yeah. That's been helpful. I think especially as I work with young people, my hope is that priests keep a zeal, their whole life. I think that's the goal. It's like nobody wants to just be kind of like at a status quo place in their marriage, or in the priesthood, but it happens, right? I think the hope, though, as the Gospels say, is that Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, Yeah, so I think there's a benefit of like being able to connect with young people. I'm not that far away, removed from their experience of high school and college.
Oh, no.
I'm coming from the same cultural, milieu, if you will, that they are. Yeah, that's right. So I get this stuff, One of my favorite things to do is just use like awkward 2-year-old cultural references with high school students, and it makes them so cringy because it's like, one, obsolete. You're a priest who shouldn't know that, but then it's also awkwardly obsolete, but it's just right on the nose that that it's obsolete and ironic. So that's been kind of
no cap
fun. Yeah, exactly.
I thought it was interesting when you're talking about all these different things you're involved with. Mm-hmm. You're a really busy guy. As we were first getting set up here in the room, you were saying, I run around. I have multiple offices in multiple places. I'm always on the road. One of the things you haven't mentioned yet on air is you also have a podcast. A lot of people might not know that. You and Father Shane actually have a podcast, yes. Outcast Catholic. What's the story there?
Exactly. One of my favorite things is it's kind of like become like a trope that there are so many podcasts out there today. There are so many Catholic podcasts that there's a trope among young people to say like, yeah, who doesn't have a podcast these days? And my joke is I'm like, tell me about your podcast because I actually have one,
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was actually during those 3 months when I was living in Sioux City, finishing grad school. Father Shane is vocation director, as many priests experienced, as many people experienced, but I think priests especially, so much of their life and ministry and work is just being with people through the celebration of the sacraments, through pastoral counseling, through the kind of work of running a parish. So during COVID, people often, and I understand, they look pretty negatively on the church for, shutting down churches, right? And there's a lot of confusion. I was asked at a recent Theology on Tap that I spoke at, like, if it happens again, they said it was kind of funny. If COVID happens again, will you guys be prepared? And I was like, that's like asking a pastor in Berlin in 1947, like, hey, if this happens again, like if the chancellor of our country becomes a dictator and like starts a war, will you be prepared for that? It's like, it was so unprecedented, it was unexpected, But I don't think a lot of people saw like people were closer to their families. Some people struggled. Some people actually really enjoyed it. People especially who'd been running around like crazy to just be with their kids in their house, to cook more, to do all these different things. A lot of people liked it. I think a lot of priests struggled. What do I do now?
Yeah.
What does my identity of a priest look like when I can't just do stuff all the time? Which is helpful because it helps a man realize that priest identity doesn't just come from the things we do.
Bingo.
It comes from who we are. It comes from our relationship with God. Father Shane, had a lot of time to think. It's like all of this running around that I'm doing now, he was doing a lot of the same kind of stuff.
So well, 2019 then?
This would have been 2019, 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah, when COVID hit. Yeah. And maybe I forget those exact years when all that happened, but yeah. So that kind of summer of 2020, right before I was ordained, Father Shane had done all this research over those months, kind of April and May. And in May, he said, hey, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. I've done all this research about what equipment to buy, how to do it, all this stuff that we were talking about before the show.
Yeah.
And he said, I want you to be my co-host. Oh, okay. So then we were working together quite a bit in preparation for ordination, all this stuff. So then we got together, we figured out how to plan the, intro music, the outro music, how to use all this equipment.
The buttons.
And then we recorded the first few episodes. But we've been going now for the whole time I've been a priest. So 3.5 years. We're putting out a weekly episode.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, but what I was telling you before, we do these 20-minute episodes, which are kind of, contra to a lot of the podcasts that have longer episodes.
3 hours,
Yeah, exactly. 6 hours, the most recent Matt Fred podcast that came out, Pints of Aquinas. But what's nice is we'll get together, and when we're in person, we're kind of bouncing back and forth between Lamar's and Sioux City. We've got all of our equipment in like a big kind of suitcase kind of thing. Now he's in St. Louis. It's actually been a little bit easier. We connect through like a video call, connect through this kind of audio website that helps kind of reduce some of the, delays.
Yeah.
And boom, we just knock out two episodes. Father Shane's kind of desire in our first episode on that podcast, Outcast Catholic, kind of is the chartering episode. What Father Shane had been realizing over his work is that people, within the church and outside of the church are finding themselves outcast kind of from an experience of communion within the church. So the kind of three different types of people that our hope was to kind of reach and to support, I think not unlike your own work. Number one was just the obvious, like disaffiliated young people who feel like the church is kind of outcast, outdated, out of touch, right? And to try to just propose anew the same gospel, right? And to just kind of try to invite people back to more of a fuller and a richer experience of what our faith has to offer. Those are, I think, the obvious people who feel kind of outcast from the church. The next one was, our rural diocese in Northwest Iowa is not unlike, it's very similar to many other kind of rural, large dioceses in the country, and especially our diocese that's been going through pastoral planning for the better part of a decade. But even it goes beyond. There was pastoral planning in the 90s, there was pastoral planning in the late 80s, right? Now I think people around the whole country are recognizing a lack of priests, a lack of engagement of people. If we think of our diocese, it's like the way our diocese was built was like the railroad came in, there's a small town every 7 miles on the railroad, all over the place, these small, wonderful, tight-knit immigrant farming communities, right? You got families having like 10 to 12 kids for like a few generations. Oh, yeah. You've got a few of those kids from each family. Workforce. Absolutely. But you got a couple kids who stay on the farm. You've got the kind of openness and the freedom saying, okay, we've had 2 world wars. We see that like life and death matters. So we've got like kind of a recognition like, yeah, the spiritual life is important. We've got a really like intricate and vast connection of Catholic schools in our diocese, right? We had tons of religious sisters, tons of priests. At one point, the Diocese of Sioux City, I think, was number 4 in the country for priest per parishioner per capita.
We were growing fast at that.
Yeah, we had tons of people. Yeah. So, yeah, it's a beautiful life. It's a beautiful place. But this recognition of now, I think more than ever, people feel very disconnected, right? Yeah. You're a young couple. You guys would be an example, right? But there's a lot of folks around the diocese who they had a formation of the faith. Maybe they had a better kind of connection to their experience of the faith within college at a Newman Center, at a Catholic university. They get back to kind of rural Iowa, and the culture has changed so much, right? What used to be just like this really solid connection of families. Yeah. It was just the churches were full, these beautiful churches. It's experience now where, okay, we show up to Mass. The feeling of community is kind of different. If you're a transplant, I've talked to folks who like marry into families. Oh, yeah. The first question in a small town is like, what's your last name? You know, and they know everything about you. There's this feeling of being even disconnected and outcast within the church.
That's right.
Like especially young people, our generation. The last one, though, is interesting. I think maybe our parents' generation, older folks who've been really faithful and lived really faithful lives, how the way the culture has gone, they find themselves outcast even within their group of friends. They kind of realize, like, and especially during and post the COVID pandemic, all of a sudden, like the people that went to Mass every week aren't going to Mass, right? The people who were really faithful, COVID kind of like was that trimming the fat experience where, and this isn't any like offense to anybody. It's just like, yeah, it was difficult, and it's easier not to go to Mass than to go to Mass. It's easier to follow the way of the culture than to try to follow Christ. So trying to recognize like, yeah, there are just like folks who've been living their life in this kind of context of like Catholic rural life for a long time that might even start having doubts later in life, start experiencing the lack of community later in life. So those three like kind of genres of folks who felt outcast have been kind of the goal. Yeah. Trying to speak within like the context of a rural Midwest diocese, and then whatever thoughts that we have. So the topics have, kind of ranged
all over the board,
but the goal was to try to keep a little bit more of like an acute focus on, there's plenty of priest podcasts out there, and there's guys who've been doing it for a lot longer than us. Yeah. The goal was to just kind of for us, by us here in the diocese. And thankfully it's been a gift, I think, to a number of people. Yeah. Thankfully I don't see the numbers, so I don't have any desire that it's like this huge booming thing, but I'm always surprised.
You don't need to know.
No. And I go around the diocese and there's plenty of people who I'm shocked. Hey, Father, thanks so much for that podcast. It's really helpful. It's like a weekly little reconnection.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually I just started listening to it only a few months ago when I was shared about that. I'm a big podcast listener, so of course I go back and I binge a lot of your older episodes, of course, right. And but actually one of the more recent ones, 2023, it was like April. I even have it written down here. Where Are the Priests was the name, and so that's kind of right in line with your job with Vocations and kind of what we're talking about too, with that feeling outcast and and why is there that distancing? Why is there that shortage of the priests?
Right.
I know this is a over talked about subject, but I feel like I really, really enjoyed that episode when you and Father Shane were talking about it, because you guys dived in deep into a whole different light that I'd ever really heard before.
Right.
Sort of the positives of it. I mean, I had never really thought about it in the way that, okay, is it really actually that bad of a thing? Is it good or bad? Is it just what is God's will for where we are right now?
Yeah.
Right. And maybe it's not going to be this whole fearful thing that, oh, we're going to go back to the days where you guys are going to be riding around on horses. I mean, that's literally what it was at first. I mean, I don't know, Father Travis, have you looked into buying a stallion? I don't know what they cost.
I have not. You know, my stepdad is a South Dakota rodeo guy, so he could probably teach me, but I don't really have the horse riding skills, you know, in the back pocket right now. But yeah, no, I'm grateful that you pointed that out, Aaron, and I'm grateful too that you said that. I don't think necessarily that it's an over talked about subject. It's complained about a lot. It's referenced a lot, especially in the past, like 5 years, especially.
Maybe that's what I meant. It's not dived in deep enough.
Exactly. And I think what's helpful is, I'll go back to this. When pastoral planning kind of got this big push in our diocese, this recognition came to kind of threefold. Like, the most obvious thing we see is that there are more priests retiring now than there are priests being ordained now.
Yeah.
So a lot of people will point out, as vocation director, they'll say, well, I have this priest crisis now, right? You'll see our vocation posters around the diocese. And right now we have 8 seminarians. We have 4 who are in grad school and 4 who are in undergrad and different levels of formation. I mean, compared to different dioceses in our country per capita,
good, right?
We're not doing terribly.
Yeah. Per capita.
Yeah, exactly. We'd love to see more men, respond to the priesthood. There's also been enormous demographic shifts in our diocese, right? At one point, our small towns, even the towns, 10,000, 5,000 people, they had enough economy and there was enough farming economy that it was like people would grow up, they'd go to Catholic schools, even public schools, but they would more or less stay kind of close. They had big families, some would take over the farm.
That's right.
Some might go to seminary, some might go to university, but they'd come back, right?
Yeah.
Teachers would come back. I think you and I know from our friends, it's like we all go to university, and then you get jobs not back in rural Iowa, right? And if you do, it's like kids from rural Iowa go to Sioux City. Kids from Sioux City go to, Omaha, Des Moines, Sioux Falls, Kansas City, So I've seen this, and I have friends in these bigger Midwest cities where they're building new parishes because they have tons of people. But when I go to those parishes, when I visit my friends and I say that I'm from Iowa, the amount of people who come out of the woodwork after Mass to tell me where they're from in Northwest Iowa, so it's pretty obvious, right?
Yeah.
We've also had a huge, immigration shift. Like, we had big immigration in the early, 20th century, late 19th century, Germany, Ireland, Luxembourg, right? That's kind of the meat of our diocese. We have a huge immigration from Latin America, from Mexico first, now from Central America. It's just shifted so much. It's just different than it is. I think the way it goes, though, we don't often see that shift when we're just living our lives, right? So when pastoral planning kind of started, there was a recognition of the demographic shifts. There's a recognition of the lack of priests that we have, or an aging kind of large block of our presbyterate, the priest of our diocese, who would eventually retire kind of at one time. And it's kind of funny because it's like, turns out people get, 1 year older each year. They have birthdays. So it's like, it's not a surprise, when these men are going to retire at 7 years old. But I think for a while, there was enough priests, there was enough people that we kind of were in a status quo for a while.
Yeah.
Well, then this recognition came, and Bishop Nicholas and some other priests on this kind of pastoral planning team, they had a consulting group that helped look at our diocese and say, okay, where have demographic shifts happen? Where do we have parishes that have like 20 people on a Sunday Mass, right? And what's the future of our diocese going forward? So when that started, I remember over the summer, we were actually in Okoboji with kind of a seminarian gathering, and Father Shane sat us down. It would have been about 2015.
Okay.
And he asked all of us, he said, when do you think the golden age of our diocese was?
Yeah.
And if you look at like the brick and mortar, if you look at the list of when things were built in the schools and everything else, it looks like the 50s. I mean, like the 50s in the U.S. and
we
the whole...
pumping out the schools and the parishes. Yeah.
I found one time in the basement of a church in Lamar's, the Globe, the former diocesan newspaper, when Bishop Miller, our bishop, who was bishop from 1948 to 1970, long time, who went to the Second Vatican Council, it was his 50th anniversary of ordination of the priesthood. And it was a list of everything that was built under his time as the bishop. And I mean, almost every town had a new convent, a new rectory, a new church. So all the churches around our diocese built in the 50s, Bishop Miller, right?
Bingo.
These big institutions that kind of came and they happened, they were good. That looks like it was this kind of golden age. But Father Shane wanted to push back on that a little bit and say, remember the pioneering years of our diocese. Like those were the years where families immigrated from Germany, from Ireland, from Luxembourg, from different countries. They established these communities, and they didn't even have a priest sometimes for like 2 years. They'd bring a priest from their family back in the old country. I can think of Lamar's, for example. Peter Galen, who the school's named after, the first mass celebrated in Plymouth County was in his home with a Father Mies, who came from Germany, and there are still Mieses in Lamar's, right?
Oh,
it's
that's
like
cool.
That founding family of the parish invited one of their kind of family priests to come. These priests came, right? They became the priest of the Archdiocese of Dubuque back then.
Sure.
And I mean, they're just like out in kind of pioneering land, right? And there's stories of, especially there's more history up in Spirit Lake and around the lakes up there, a priest who'd show up and people hadn't had mass for like 2 years, but these people were still very faithful, forming their families you think of like, it's almost like the Christians in Japan, Christians in China who didn't have priests for like 500 years and they were still raising their family in the faith. Yeah. But like the impetus came from the laity in such a real way of like, our faith is so important. We just brought it across an ocean and then halfway across the country. We're trying to establish this place. So how do we form our children well? We build a school. We invite a community of religious sisters in, right? So like this is the structure. Father Shane was pointing out is like the kind of tenacity and the faith of some of these priests who, would go on like a 100-mile, round trip on a Sunday and celebrate masses all over the place on a horse, right? That type of self-sacrifice, there wasn't a lot of status quo there. I mean, it was like the sacraments are important, the proclamation of the gospel is important, the formation of our young people is important. Boom. That's what we're about. We got to a place where we had a pastor or two, priest in every small town. What are you doing? Hanging out by the phone, waiting for things to happen, right? People grew up with that. So I think what we got to with this positive recognition is like a status quo in the faith is never a good thing. Christendom is not bad. Christendom, when like the kind of culture itself is Christian, it's not bad. And the expectation in a time of Christendom is that formation of the faith is more by osmosis, right? We raise our families, we go to mass, but the culture itself will kind of like raise our children in the faith. As you look around today, it's like that's clearly not the case.
Yeah.
That's why you guys are doing this good work. That's why we're trying to do this good work. That's why Catholic families, that's why priests are trying to still proclaim the gospel. That's like ever ancient, ever new, as St. Augustine said.
Yeah.
But a status quo can always kind of keep us from kind of growing, keep us from personally growing in our conviction to Christ, keep us from proclaiming the gospel. So I think what we're seeing now is like everything has been kind of shifted. It's hard because for, I think, older people who are used to the way things are, it's hard to see things change. But I think what I've noticed of younger people and the men coming to the seminary, there is this insistence of proclamation of the gospel, this insistence of evangelization. And it's not so much, we're just here to serve the folks, do the things and play some golf and
it's not that.
Have a good day, So it's a challenge. And the whole world is experiencing this. The Midwest is experiencing this, especially. A lot of dioceses are stepping into pastoral planning now, and they're looking to us and they're saying, hey, how do we do this? So it's a challenge, but I think the recognition is that there's always challenge in the life of the church. And if we're not growing, it's kind of that, we'll talk about this in spiritual life. You're either going forward or you're going backwards. There's not a lot of just sitting in the middle,
Yeah.
So a time of kind of questioning the structure of what we have in front of us is helpful to say, okay, what does our life as priests look like? What does our life as Catholics look like?
Yeah, and you were talking about the culture, but we can't really change that, right? We can't change the culture. What can we change? What needs to change to address this priest shortage? And maybe that isn't even the issue, but just how about our Catholic environment around us? Whether it's in our own home, whether it's in the parish community, whether it's in the larger scale Catholic community as a whole. It's obviously we can't change the culture, but what are we going to do?
Right. We can't necessarily change the culture as we want to, but it's interesting. Two things come to mind. A book was published from the University of Mary in Bismarck in 2020 called Christendom to Apostolic Mission. And the whole premise of the book, it's very short, 100 pages. The whole premise is that the church has existed in the first couple centuries in this apostolic age. 12 men are commissioned by Christ to go proclaim the gospel. He rises from the dead. He sends the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. They receive the Holy Spirit and they do that. And they keep going. And the reason we have the faith here today is because that happened, right? Well, that apostolic age, like these men are coming from this Jewish context. Gentiles are being converted. But then as they go to Rome, as they go all over the Middle East, they are in front of a pagan culture who's never heard of Christ. So the proclamation of Christ is accompanied with these signs and wonders because it's new, it's fresh, it's exciting.
Yeah.
Then as we see through church history, in a good way, right, as more people were converted, we moved into this time of Christendom where the majority of the world, was baptized Christians. And then like the culture itself was imbued with the gospel. And people still talk about America like that, our Judeo-Christian values,
Yeah.
They talk about that. We can see today that our culture is for the first time in a post-Christian age. So we're not necessarily in this apostolic age where people have never heard of Christ, and we're not in this Christendom where everybody's living and breathing with the gospel.
Yeah.
We're in this post-Christian age. C.S. Lewis said the apostles would have looked at the culture like trying to woo over a young maiden. He said now the way the church kind of functions is like trying to win back a bitter divorcee, right? And that's the truth. However, I was just giving a theology on tap. I was up in Algona in Kossuth County, and I gave this theology on tap just a couple weeks ago with Father Zach and Father Matthew up there at a distillery, which is kind of cool in Bancroft, Iowa. And Father Zach asked if I would talk about the universal call to holiness that came from the Second Vatican Council. That's always been the teaching of the church, that every baptized Christian is called to holiness. It's not something special reserved for priests and religious sisters, right?
No.
And we've missed that sometimes when we just sort of, there's been so many priests, there's been so many sisters that we've kind of assumed that like formation in the faith, proclamation of the gospel primarily happens in the context of people wearing fancy robes.
And only that.
Exactly, right? And I don't want to like denigrate like the real kind of like transmission of the faith that happened in families. But I think if you would, ask many Catholics, like, are you an evangelist? It's like, whoa. What are you talking about? I think today, especially as we talk about these podcasts, we see these kind of like over the past 30 years, Catholic Answers. We see these podcasts, especially today. We see these Catholic speakers. We see things like the Focuses Seek conference. We see different things like the Steubenville conferences over the summer that have gained so much traction. We see that the laity have really taken up their call that was actually really clear in the Second Vatican Council. This is what I want to get back to answer your original question, Aaron. I was walking through chapter 4 of Lumen Gentium. That's the document about the church.
Yeah.
Chapter 4 is all about the laity. It's just a couple pages. And then chapter 5 is about the universal call to holiness. There was this money line in the middle of the section of chapter 4 that said the laity become a leaven within the culture, right? So priests and sisters are always going to exist kind of on the outside of the culture. It's like, yeah, I live in Sioux City. I go to a coffee shop. I go to a cocktail bar. I know people. I go around. I go to these restaurants, whatever. I see these people. But I stand as like a contradiction. I wear these clerics. I wear a cassock, and it stands as a real contradiction of like, what is that guy living? Like most people don't wear this kind of stuff. It's like, what is that guy doing? And as a celibate too, I kind of stand as like a signpost that points to heaven, that there's some greater reality that's going on.
Yeah.
That's good. My sphere of influence, though, is mostly the people that I interact with within the church.
Yeah.
What the church points out for the laity is that the laity exist in the world in all of these, like, interesting places that I would never get to go, right?
Yeah.
I don't work in, like, a Tyson meatpacking plant. There's
Yeah.
thousands of people who work there. I don't have the same connections as you do with the different people within your life, your family, your friends, people you live and work with. So the laity from their baptism are invited to be a leaven within. Just like leaven within a loaf of bread, that it's like from within, there comes this like, it kind of raises something higher. So how can we change the culture?
That's exactly the mission of what we're doing with Catholic Passage.
Exactly right.
Rising up the
from
faithful.
within. From within. So the question, and this is what's really helpful, not to just reference these random talks I've given, but like I gave another little kind of something similar talk to lay folks in Remsen, and the proposal for me going there was a bunch of like super hot button topics. And they're like, why does the Pope hate the Latin Mass? What do we do with these German bishops and all these different like real problems in the life of the church?
Yeah.
What I came to with it though, and this is what I think is so important for Catholic Passage, the church's social teaching on subsidiarity says that we need to take things at the local level first, right? That a big giant federal government shouldn't control what happens in your house, right? So if that's the same way with the transmission of the faith, that like problems in Germany are problems in Germany and they're important, but it's actually not your job to worry about the German bishops. It's not your job to worry about if the Pope does or does not hate the Latin Mass, these really like, provocative statements or something. I said what's important, and this is what the church has called us to, this is what Christ calls us to, like your own personal holiness first. That's what starts, right? So it's like, are you holy? Are you receiving the sacraments? Are you going to confession? Do you have a prayer life at all, that's the first step. And the next thing is like your family, your friends, the people in your immediate circle, and then your parish, building up the parish as the like locus for the, kingdom of God, the body of Christ in your local community. And then if you have any more time in your day or in your life, any more energy to exert, how can you build up the diocese, right? Yeah. Okay, that's what these kind of works, these apostolates are doing. You should have no time or energy to worry about what's happening in another part of the world, right? Sure. There are people who have jobs to worry about that for you. What the kind of like constant news cycle does, it just keeps us in this like anxious state of worry that takes us away from actually being leaven within the world. So even that question, I can't change the culture. No, I can't go demand and complain that the culture go back to some kind of nostalgic age. What I can do is I can change the culture of my own heart. I can change the culture of my own family. I can change the culture of my own parish.
Bingo.
Like how I engage with it, what I do.
That's right. How
I respond to Christ's call in my life.
And ideally, if everybody in theory would to change their own individual culture, their own familial culture, that's going to then change the overall culture.
That's the hope. And what's wild is we've seen it happen in the past. I mean, we've seen it happen. It's like, I love the example of Our Lady Guadalupe in Mexico.
Yeah, that's right.
That wasn't that long ago, right? In like the 1500s in Mexico, people bring this up as an intense example, but it's like the Aztec kind of empire was still kind of ruling. And there had been Spanish colonialization that had happened, but like in certain small parts of, the Aztec world, there was still child sacrifice happening. Oh, yeah. That apparition of Mary at Tepeyac Hill to St. Juan Diego happens. And within like a couple decades, you've got hundreds of thousands of people being baptized, hundreds of thousands of people converting to the faith. And now Mexico, one of the biggest Catholic countries in the world, second biggest Catholic country in the world, having gone through persecution, right? Yeah. Having gone through the persecution of the Cristeros Wars in the 1930s, those immigrants who've brought the faith here, I am so privileged to be able to have learned Spanish and to minister with these people because their faith is so strong. And it's like, this faith is coming from like a converted paganism, right? So it's like, that's not that long ago. No. And that actually happened, right? The same thing happened in Poland during, the communist kind of regime there with the Soviets there. It's like the Soviet government was intentionally trying to eradicate Christianity from Poland. There was one particular town it was a new Soviet town that was established without a church. The idea was that the state would be kind of like the religion of the day. And the people revolted, and that we need Christ, and then like with the kind of champion call from John Paul II, they're a Catholic country again, and I've met some Poles and like, they are stronger Catholics than most, so it's like, it is possible. Yeah. It is possible, but it doesn't start at just the level of, kind of political change. That's the hope, but that's for good Catholic politicians to kind of work in that sphere.
Yeah.
What can we do in Northwest Iowa? We can continue to do what we've always done and build up the family, build up the church, build up the parish,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, from within. Yeah, and I really like your term leaven like that. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I'm going to use that probably with Catholic passage now.
Well, no, please do, because, Jesus points out in the gospel, he says, like, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, because in a certain way, it can be good or bad. Because from within, like a bad leaven can actually create like a bad dough. Sure. People make sourdough now all the time. I don't know anything about it, right? But it takes a lot of intentionality. Right. It's like if you don't actually have care and attention for what's going on, it's not going to be good. It's actually going to go bad. But then what can good leaven do? So beware of the leaven of the scribes and the Pharisees, but also be aware of the leaven that you can also create, right? Because here's the deal, in a parish, in a family, it's like the level of complaining, the level of dissatisfaction. The question isn't if you're dissatisfied, it's what do you do with the dissatisfaction? We're still in Lent when we record this. And last year, I went on a little Lenten retreat, and the priest said this super convicting line that I've been sharing in confession for the past year. And I love to share it, and it's been so convicting for me. He said, moments of dissatisfaction, which will inevitably come in my own experience, my own personal life, my own soul, interior life, my mind, my body, my heart, in my family, in my parish, in my community, in the culture. Moments of dissatisfaction are often when we try to distract ourselves from problems. He said a moment of dissatisfaction ought to be a moment where like an alarm starts going off in my interior life and says, this is exactly where Christ wants to meet me, right? Yeah. So we have fewer priests. So we have parish mergers. So we have things happening in the culture that we're not happy about, right? Dang kids these days doing things, like everybody says. Well, what's the response to that? Not just the reaction of complaining, but is there a response that says, okay, if this is a real alarm that says this is where I need Christ to come and change me, change my situation, all of a sudden then I'm no longer a slave to my circumstance. I'm not a slave to my kind of dissatisfaction, I recognize that he's my destiny. He's what I'm made for. And then he can actually come and he can change this like situation I find myself in. Yeah. That's hopeful.
Like that. One thing that I was kind of thinking about, I'm going back a little bit to the vocations and just kind of understanding the priesthood from the laity level, from just an everyday person like me, right? I feel like there's sort of a level of comfort that isn't there, like a lack of comfort. Yeah. And this is just something while I was driving down to Sioux City this morning I thought about. So the listeners can't see it, but you can. I'm completely clean shaven now. Yeah. And it's been like years since I've been clean shaven. Okay. I think since my wedding, actually. Okay. And the whole reason is because my wife and I have some guests that showed up last night, some good friends of ours from Twin Cities, and they have a little girl, sweet little girl, but she was like scared of me last night because I have a lot of dark hair and a beard. And it's not just me. I think they said it's a phase they're going through. Sure. She's going through. But her dad doesn't have like any hair on his whole head. Yeah. So one thing, and I know I'm stretching here with a little bit of the metaphor, but there was that fear from the lack of familiarity. Yes. But I just thought of, there's that lack of familiarity with the priests, even your local priests that you've had for, let's say, 7 years even. Oh, sure. Or just the priesthood in general. And maybe it's not fear. Maybe it's apprehension. Maybe it's just there's a little bit of distancing from that. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's a little bit of a stretch there, but what do you think? No, it was good. Well, and that conversation that you and I had after we hung out together at the lakes was actually really helpful for me to understand that too. No, there's a great misunderstanding culturally, even within the church, about who the priest is. Yeah. Huge misunderstanding about the sacraments. We're in this Eucharistic revival. There's been a lot of conversation in the time of pastoral planning of, okay, if we can't have Mass in this parish, this is like actual quotes that came from our diocese. Could we just like wheel, a TV in, have like a, stream Mass from the next town over, and then somebody just pops out and distributes communion, right? Sure, would that get the job done of I got Jesus today? Sure. We'd miss and understand what the Mass is for. We misunderstand who the priest is, what the priesthood is. We misunderstand what celibacy is, right? So I hear it all the time. Kids are like, well, why don't you just become a deacon? Best of both worlds, Yeah. You be married, you get to have kids, but you get to wear a vestment once in a while, you get to preach, you get to baptize, you get to do some stuff. But it misses the call that goes all the way back to Christ, right? The priesthood is a configuration to the heart of Jesus. St. John Vianney said that the priesthood is the love of the heart of Jesus. And the celibacy that we take on, that we practice, that we receive as a call, it goes back to Jesus, right? Jesus was the celibate man who was the bridegroom of the church and who laid down his life on the cross as if a marriage bed, right? We don't have a lot of them in our diocese, if any. I think of St. Peter's in Rome. Yeah. That big baldacchino of the altar, that tradition of having the big canopy, four-posted canopy, comes from the Jewish tradition of a Jewish couple was married under a hupula, which is like a four-posted canopy. Yeah. And then where does a four-posted bed come from? Is that they would have a four-posted bed so that the consummation of their marriage under this hupula was a direct connection to where they made their vows, right? So Christianity, using these beautiful Jewish traditions, they placed this canopy over the altar. Now, it does a practical thing in a huge church like St. Peter's. It draws your eye to the altar, but it also is a helpful recognition that Christ the bridegroom, right, who laid down his life on the cross, lays down his life on this marriage bed of the altar for his bride, the church, right? Yeah, it opens up so much. It's not just about hearing a good message. It's not just about singing some songs. It's not just about receiving the Eucharist. It's about offering my life in sacrifice with Christ on the cross. And the priest, who stands in the person of Jesus, becomes an incarnational sign of his presence, right? That one of the first things that happens in Mass is the priest vested, not himself, not just me as Travis Crotty, but as a priest, says the Lord be with you, right? Mm-hmm. And first is this recognition of apostolic succession, right? That Christ's presence is enfleshed. It's not just something in my head. Then we move into the scriptures, and then from the scriptures, the story of salvation, we move, boom, right there where bread and wine become his body and blood, right? So we miss what the priesthood is. And like I say that because it's wildly humbling to do that. And I'm sure you've seen this in marriage too. Nothing helps you recognize how selfish you are like promising to love somebody for the rest of your life. Yeah. You're like doing pretty well as an engaged guy, or like I was a great seminarian. And then all of a sudden it's like, I promised to be a priest for these people in this particular diocese, in this particular parish, and immediately realized like, I cannot give them what they need. I'm not worthy of this call. But that's what the apostles experienced too. That's what St. Peter experienced too. Yeah, they're like, I can't do this alone. Yeah, Lord, like, depart from me, I'm a sinful man, right? And Jesus picks him up and he says, I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Like,
go build my church.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, so weak men and women are constantly called to be Christ's presence in the world. But yeah, the priesthood is this interesting place where we're invited to live, especially diocesan priests. We live within the context of people's lives, but then we live kind of like in a similar, like without, right? So I think the fun story just to share, it's like, so I went to cover some masses at the lakes, right? I didn't know what I was going to be doing. I knew my friends who live in Spirit Lake. They had met you and your wife, right? And they're like, hey, you want to come to this random concert? It was Winter Games, right? So I'd never met you guys, but we like showed up to this random concert for those in Northwest Iowa, the Pork Tornadoes. They were impressive, right? Impressive cover band. And we just had a blast, right? And then I had mass the next morning after we hung out, like goofing around and singing and dancing at this place, having random mystery beers from the bar, cheap or whatever. Like we showed up and I had mass, and you talked to me afterwards and you said like, it was this weird jarring experience of like, we shared just like humanity the night before. We weren't doing anything bad. I mean, we were just like enjoying this like fun music.
Well,
right?
our singing was pretty bad.
Singing was great. I
was going to say, you're an amazing singer. And for anybody that doesn't know, Father Travis has amazing dance skills. Like,
there we go.
Like mad.
I'm actually pretty bad. I'm just like very much a white guy dancing, just like.
But you're confident. That's all that matters.
It was just having a good time. But then you had mentioned like the weird experience of like spending that time together. And then the next morning I'm like, boom, the next time you see me, I'm vested as a priest. And how there was like a weird like disconnect there of like, it's uncomfortable in that tension.
For a split second, I had to like reality check myself and just deliberately bring myself into, well, communion for it. I was ready for the Mass. I had to like, okay, this is Father Travis here. I had to change myself.
Right. People will kind of point this out. For me and other priests, they'll be like kind of shocked. Because I think, and this isn't anything against my brother priest, but like, I think in the past there was a desire to make the Mass a place of more familiarity, right?
Yeah.
And to say, okay, this is an uncomfortable thing. It's like the Mass was in Latin. The priest faces the same direction as the people. There's these beautiful churches, but there's kind of signs and symbols that might not be as approachable. So the desire was to try to make the sacraments, the liturgy, the church more approachable. But in so doing, we kind of moved away from a transcendent experience of the sacraments to more of kind of a, familial experience, which has its merits. But I think what we've seen over the years, what's happened then is like, my expectation is that, this like good old boy that I see like around town, he'll just tell me a nice like joke and a story. What I found in myself is like, people will be impressed. They'll say, you're so good with the kids, but when you go to Mass, you're so like prayerful and like reverent. And I'm like, and I talked to my brother priest about this. It's like, well, right, because I'm doing two different things, right? It's like you're going to act different like at work than you are with like the intimacy with like your wife just in the,
Personally, I think it's a beautiful witness. Mm-hmm. So the very first time I ever was at Mass where you visited up at the lakes, sure. I remember seeing you and you're like, and my first thought is, oh, wow, he looks really young. He's got like a baby face like me.
Absolutely.
And you're like kind of quiet, very reverent. And I love that. Beautiful witness of that importance, because I feel a whole separate topic is sort of a lack of reverence. We can talk about that. But then throughout the whole Mass, I'm just, this is great. Then finally, you read the gospel in that same voice, that same quieter voice and reverence, even reading the gospel. Right. And then all of a sudden you like pause a second and then your eyes like light up, your eyebrows shoot up. You do a giant smile like that, beautiful smile. Yeah. And then you're like, hey, I'm Father Travis Crotty. And then you like give a joke and you start like doing, Gen Z references, all this stuff. And I'm just like, this guy like completely chameleoned here. But I thought that was great because it's showing that you are a real person. You have humor. Oh my gosh, you can laugh, you can smile, you can enjoy yourself, you can relate to people, you can have these separate interests, you can dance, right, and sing. But when it comes to the important thing, when it comes to being irreverent, you are going to, and you're going to change because that's necessary. You're showing that importance of that. Yeah. And I'm not saying that you're trying to just put on a show. I'm not implying that. It literally is, you are witnessing that out through your life.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that kind of experience because it's not a shtick. Both sides of it is not a shtick where it's like, now I'm going to go do this kind of like super intense, kind of like hardcore shtick where I like celebrate Mass, and then I'm going to do this like kind of funny, jokey shtick. Honestly, and I can. So there's a cool phrase that Pope Benedict XVI kind of proposed in his book called Spirit of the Liturgy. That was he stole the title from Guardini in the past, but then he kind of just wanted to talk about what is the spirit of the celebration of the sacraments that we have. And he uses this phrase, ars celebrandi, which is kind of like the flex to just throw out a Latin word, but it just means the art of celebration.
Okay.
So this is the idea, though. It's not just, so people will say sometimes in the Mass, we're given these instructions by the church, and they say just do the red and say the black. The black are the words that you say, and the red are the instructions. It's like, don't variate from that. Just do the red and say the black.
Sure.
But then what the Pope points out is like the art of celebration of the Mass, right? This is like anybody in their different like work or whatever. There's the kind of the nuance there. The ars celebrandi is the experience of like, this is a moment of communal prayer, and I'm leading others in prayer. But if I'm not in prayer myself, if I'm not praying, if I'm not kind of just like being obedient, not in kind of a weird like, I'm enslaved to these rubrics or something. No, it's this, I'm obedient to what the church has offered so that I can be more of an instrument of God's presence, right? Mm. So at the celebration of the Mass, I mean, the reason we wear vestments is that so I don't just look like myself, right? Yep. The reason we wear vestments is that they reflect the glory of heaven that is coming to meet us right now. That when I walk into a church, and especially the churches up the lakes, St. Joseph and St. Mary's, they're beautiful churches, right? That's why it's important to have beautiful churches, because it's not just the rest of my life. I'm walking into this unique experience where the immanence, the closeness of God, in my daily life meets the transcendence of God, right? And that my daily life is actually caught up in that which is above. That's what is transcendent. And what's wild as a priest is like, we're invited in seminary formation to be bridge builders, not to be an obstacle to people of God. But that happens there where it's like, I want to actually get out of the way when I'm celebrating Mass. I want to get out of the way, and I want to allow people to pray. So I want to chant as best as I can. I want to pray the prayers of the Mass with an intentionality, with a kind of sobriety, right? The Roman rite has always been discussed as being called a noble simplicity. Mm. There's a noble simplicity of the Roman rite, whereas compared to like the Orthodox Church, there's a lot going on in Orthodox liturgy. The Roman rite has this noble simplicity, but the more I can get out of the way, and I can actually allow myself and my humanity to reflect Christ and his humanity and divinity, right? That's actually an invitation for you to offer your humanity to be caught up in God's divinity, right? But then preaching, kind of the art of preaching, is now taking the gospel, taking the truth of the liturgy, taking this kind of transcendent reality and offering it to and applying it to life. And that's the way Jesus preached.
Absolutely.
When he's got these different analogies in the scriptures, what's helpful when you study scriptures, you learn that like he was actually just preaching about things that were like right next to him. So he's talking about the good shepherd in John. It's because there's some sheep right next to him. Like they're just walking and there's some sheep, right? When he talks about like a grain of wheat must fall to the ground and die, they're walking through some wheat, right? So it's like, it's beautiful, and it's this incarnational way of like living and preaching that it's like, no, it's not something that's up and above. It's that my life that I'm experiencing right now, this wheat field, this flock of sheep, the shepherd that I see every day, that actually has something, and it has everything to do with my eternal destiny, right? And it's caught up into that in this like profound way, right? So that's my desire, to do that. But I think what's beautiful is that celibacy in married life, the priesthood in married life, kind of just the clergy and the laity, it's supposed to be this mutual enrichment, right? That it's like, as I kind of spend time with families and spend time with people, I stop becoming just like a brain in a vat, this kind of this cerebral experience, and I'm brought back into my humanity, right?
Yeah.
Because I do spend times within the sacraments, right? But then as like I spend time with families, and then families also get to do this and be enriched by this reality too, where it's like
very relational.
Yeah, we're living this relational life within our families and spouses, within children, and within extended families. That actually, that's a place where God wants to meet us too. God's not just trapped in the church or locked in the tabernacle. He wants to actually, be a part of it. So that
he's going out.
I think that mutual enrichment that I found in myself, and the more I spend time with families, that gives me a context for preaching. So I'm not just trying to think of what do the folks want today, or like what's a funny joke I can say. It's not like. No, the humor comes in that, like, I know the same life, so I can just point out, like, funny things about, like, Catholic life of, like, we all show up to Mass and do the same things and never think about it.
Yep.
You kind of point it out, and it kind of opens up a space to say, oh, wait, there can be a reception of the gospel right now into my experience,
Yeah.
Not just someday down the road.
I was viewing it as it's you, the person, who happens to be funny. It's not you are coming up with this after-dinner speech that you are going to try to get everybody paying attention with a joke, and then you're just going to say the things that'll get people listening the best and make them feel warm fuzzies or whatever.
Right.
And then they leave. and then you leave, and then there's departure, and there's that distancing. No, because we're called to come together in that relationship,
right,
and have a better understanding. You were talking about your vestments and why you do things and why is this way. There's a lot of Catholics, not just the Protestants, that don't understand that. I'm serious,
absolutely.
like a lot. They actually, I've heard from many Catholics, it's sad, and I explain it, where they're like, okay, yeah, he just wears it because that shows that he's different.
Yeah.
And I guess that's better than saying that it's to make them look fancy or something. But
yeah, and I've had atheist friends or family members in the past who said, oh, yeah, the most important guy in the room has to wear the fancy vestments so everybody can see him and he can, share the most important things because he knows more than everybody else. It's like,
yeah,
that's not the case. Yeah, that's not the case at all. There's actually this humility that says, yeah, whether I want to wear vestments today or not, I'm putting on these vestments to help me pray, to help other people pray. I was just thinking when we were speaking earlier about this kind of tension that we find ourselves in, this discomfort and then this comfort. St. John Chrysostom, this kind of church father from the East, he said that preaching, but I think this ties into like the liturgy, the experience of the church. He said the goal of the preacher should be to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable, right?
Yeah.
That's important tension. We need to like check ourselves with that too. Am I just trying to do this because it's what makes me comfortable? Do I just want to be comfortable? Fulton Sheen had this just like money line where he said, Christ did not call us to be comfortable. He called us to be new men. He said he didn't call us to be nice people. He called us to be new men.
Yeah.
That's his question. It's like, yeah, I need to be comforted in moments of like real suffering and sorrow, but I need to be kind of challenged and afflicted sounds intense, but I need to be kind of, that's why we're in Lent right now. It's like, I need to be kind of encouraged and spurred on.
Yeah.
I'm in moments of just kind of, status quo or just, comfort.
And I know there's a pressure, or there can be, from the secular world, and this is one of the things that us lay people need to pray for our priests for, because that's another thing that's like, oh yeah, our priests are praying for us. Yeah, no, we got to pray for you guys too. You guys have a lot of spiritual angst and a lot of warfare going on there. One of the things that I've thought that I think is important to pray for you guys is so that you don't feel the pressures of the world where I need to say this certain thing to make people feel happy.
Yeah.
And I have told my pastor, I've told him after a couple times where I was like, hey, I just want to tell you, thank you for that homily.
Right.
Because I guarantee you there's going to be some people that are kind of torqued off by it.
Yes.
You torqued off some people today in the pews. I looked around and I saw some,
exactly.
the faces, whatever,
right,
whether they were young or old. And I just said, thank you for that message, because you weren't just trying to make us feel warm and fuzzy and leave happy from your homily, because that's not the point.
That's not what Jesus did.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's not, we're also not out here to just be jerks, but it's like different times in the life of the church, it's like, yeah, meeting a family and the experience of the loss of a loved one, especially in an untimely death or just like a difficulty of losing children or whatever it might be, it's like, yeah, that's not the time to hit them hard, but the proclamation of the gospel, it's like, Jesus is the same, as I said earlier yesterday, the same in today and tomorrow, where it's like Jesus invites conversion all the time. So what I found is like even the experience of preaching in the context of a wedding that is very like beautiful and happy and joyful gets to be an invitation for conversion. Preaching in the context of a funeral that's really difficult, the kind of easy way is just to try to just smooth it over and make it feel comfortable. It's like, oh no, like
only talk about mercy.
Yeah, and mercy
and love.
But mercy and love. That necessitates a conversion of heart,
Bingo. People forget that part.
Yeah, that's where it comes from, yeah. And I would just say this, like more and more we can see this in our own generation today. What I've just noticed is this with our peers. There's not a lot of status quo with like millennials and Gen Z. It's like you are either intentionally following Christ and you know it's going to be difficult, or you've basically just given up.
Complete opposite, possibly.
Yeah, which there's a lot of reasons for that, right?
Sure.
You give up for all sorts of different reasons because of the, clergy abuse crisis. You give up because, the parish life has kind of gone down to kind of like a beige experience of whatever.
Or I just don't like my pastor.
Oh yeah. I don't like my pastor, don't like my church, don't like the music, don't like whatever. Yeah.
The music's too old.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, lots of thoughts.
Yeah.
All those things. But I think what it comes back to every single time though is like, I'm either growing closer to Christ or I'm not. Yeah. Right. And to realize that Christ invited me to conversion is not a violence being done to me. Maybe someday, that'd be kind of cool. Flannery O'Connor, the author, Southern author from Georgia who wrote in the 60s, she's this fascinating, interesting Catholic author. And if you read her stuff, you wouldn't know she was a Catholic. Some of her stories, because they're like weird and kind of dark. People are like dying, like bulls kind of like spearing somebody with their horn, just like crazy stuff.
Yeah.
But her whole point is, she said, when people are kind of asleep, you need to like give them a little shock to wake them up. But the other point was, every story that she has, she emphasizes, and some are more nuanced than others, a moment where grace is being offered. And the main character is either accepting or rejecting the offer of grace that's present, right? The genius of what she does is that it shows that like grace is not doing violence to me, right? It's like a river is only violent when something gets in the way of its flow. So a river is just doing its thing. And even like a river on its banks, we're up in the Missouri right now. It's like the river's just doing its thing. When Lewis and Clark came up the Missouri River, it's like the river wasn't bad. The river's just doing its thing. Well, all of a sudden you start building houses on the banks of the river. You start putting things in the way. And if a big log kind of jams up a dam, it's like there's violence, there's rapids because of the object that's in the way, not because of the river, right? So when we recognize like a tension, we recognize a discomfort, God's not the one like imposing like a violence on me. And then I want to just get away from that because it's uncomfortable. It's like,
It's the barrier.
no, the discomfort is what's the thing in me that's in the way.
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I love how you can connect to whether you're talking to the older people or the younger people. And with your messaging there, I love your metaphors. And earlier we used the term zeal, and you got the energy. You're this young blood with all this energy and zeal, and that's great. And you spoke on a really good point that you hope the zeal passes through many years, even with whatever age you are as a priest. But what about the lay people? How might you see that zeal being passed on to the lay people?
Yeah, what I get excited about, young people, our generation, have a lot of zeal about a lot of things, right? There's a lot of desire to see change. What I've noticed that's kind of fun, because I like the same things that my peers like. I like going to like craft stuff. I love like craft coffee, craft beer and cocktails, whatever. I like that kind of like craft stuff that moves away from maybe kind of like this kind of suburbanization of like the 80s, right? And you're watching like a gentrification happen in like cities, right, where young people want to move back into a downtown, into an apartment building, and they want that kind of like, there's a nostalgia for the past, right?
Sure.
Because there's a desire to see some kind of change, and there's like a zeal there, right? Where you talk about young couples who are like, desiring more natural means of birth, or the way that they're like raising their children. They're kind of pushing back against these cultural standards that have been developed over time and asking the questions, is this good?
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Why is this good? What do I actually want to see change, right? Are people seeing that about their own communities, right? All these different things. The potential for that zeal is there in young families, right? The potential for something more is there. There's just this channeling of recognizing that we actually all do have a religious sense, and that desire for something more is actually a proof that we have a destiny beyond this world. I don't know why this like random analogy has come up so much, but I've been sharing it with a lot of high school kids. But it's like cats, dogs, cows, pigs. They want like three things. Like they want to like eat food, drink water, not necessarily be uncomfortable in the sun all day, and then like make more dogs, cats, cows, pigs.
Yeah, pretty simple.
It's like that's what they want, and those things pretty much happen all the time. They don't necessarily want to like get in a truck and like go to like end of their life and become bacon and stuff, but like that's what they want. They don't. So it's like dogs and cats don't sit around like wondering about their future and having anxiety and like whatever. People are like, my dog has anxiety. It's like whatever, but like they also don't think about their dead grandparents. They also don't think about like the mistakes they've made or what they want. So the fact that as humans, it's not just because we have some greater level of consciousness and we're just like the best animals out there. The fact that we have this like always this insatiable desire to know something more, to do something more, that zeal, and it gets seen in different ways. That's a proof that we're made for something more. That's my friend's Baptist church when I was in high school, because it's like go to prom with my friends. I went to mass and like went to 8:00 mass in a white tuxedo, and then I immediately went to the Baptist church with my friends afterwards.
Oh, wow.
Went to the church, and I remember one time I was at this Baptist church. The pastor gave this really interesting sermon, and he showed this video where it talked, the audio was about like sacrificing to things that weren't God, and it showed videos of like different kind of like tribal pagan religion throughout the world. Yeah. Okay. And it stops, and the guy in the video is like, maybe that didn't make sense. Let's just play that again. All of the audio stayed exactly the same, talking about sacrificing to false gods, and all of the video was just about college football. And it was very interesting because the point was like, oh yeah, we all have to sacrifice at some altar.
Yeah.
Get back to this whole zeal thing. It just shows it's like, oh yeah, like it's not that we're not zealous. It's not that we're just totally apathetic. Young people aren't completely apathetic. They look apathetic. They care about a lot of stuff. They care a lot about justice. They care a lot about the poor. They care a lot about like making the world a better place.
Yeah.
It's just to kind of tap into that and to say like, but where's this world cannot be the end. I mean, like we can't just make this world a perfect utopia. It doesn't work out. Right.
Yeah. It seems like that youngest generation is more so not okay with that. Just being the end. Exactly. They are yearning and striving for that something more. It's just a little bit out there. It's just at the fingertips.
So older people can look at the young people and they say like, why are they trying to like, demonetize the police in cities? It's like, because they want to see a change, the kind of a cultural revolution happen.
Why do they care so much about global politics?
Exactly.
Because they want to see a change and they want to see something.
Why do they care so much about global warming and all that stuff, right? A change. What's helpful then is like to point out that in the past, there have been philosophies, there have been efforts to try to change the world that never work, right? And, because we need another random saint quote from Father Crotty today, but like St. Therese of Lisieux really helpfully said, the world is thy ship and not thy home. Until we recognize that. So like that's the transition of zeal. It's like, it's not that young people are just losers. Some of them are. It's not that everybody's just sitting around doing nothing. There's a real desire that's latent there. But how do I kind of stoke that flame, right? I can ask that question as a priest, as a pastor of souls someday. That's a question that families should ask. That's a question that every individual should ask of like, how can this like zeal be stoked and how can it be kind of channeled? The liturgy helps with that. The scriptures help with that. The Christian community helps with that.
Yeah. And things like these podcasts, like something like you're doing, what our whole mission at Catholic Passage is we're raising up the lay faithful. And, the tagline of the mission would be we're supporting parents and educators as they try to pass on the faith and their way of life to their children and students. But it's, you have lay people, lay-led, they are sharing the witnesses. They are sharing this content. And if they are sharing their witness verbally through a video or whatnot, the key thing is it's not just that you are sharing this witness and like, this is the way of life. This is what I feel about my faith. This is like a witness from my everyday life. The other thing is they themselves are the witness in the flesh and how they live out their life and in their family. I think that's beautiful.
I do too. Yeah. People ask all the time, maybe I just offer this as kind of maybe just like a closing invitation for folks who are like listening to this, right? People ask all the time, older folks whose adult children have left the faith, younger couples whose high school children have left the faith, right? Young couples who are kind of like really concerned about how to raise their children in the faith and not experience what their parents are experiencing with their peers,
Exactly.
So all the time, every time I give a talk or anything, if there's option for Q&A, it's never about what I talked about. It's always about how do we keep our kids in the faith? What do we do? What I've been encouraging a lot, and this is what you guys are doing here at Catholic Passage, parents, but everybody must become a witness to the reality that Christ is meeting them, right? In the past, you could send your kid to a Catholic school and go to Mass every Sunday and like live a good life and teach them how to be a good person. And the Christian milieu would kind of fill in the cracks. We need to have witnesses that actually share with like parents sharing with their children why you believe what you believe.
Yeah.
You don't have to have a philosophy degree to do that. Like why you're convicted and what you're convicted by, right? Why this matters for you. Like that matters, right? And that needs to change. I thought I had some just awesome quote that I was going to share to just kind of conclude that. And it might come to me and it might not, but I think that's just so important. I remembered it. Here it is. St. Paul VI, okay, who would have been the Pope right before John Paul II.
Yeah.
He wrote a document called Evangelii Nuntiandi, which is about the proclamation of the gospel. And he said that, and you've probably heard it before, and people have probably heard it said, but it's important to hear again. He said, modern man, and if he's talking about people in the 60s, it means even more so today. Modern man doesn't listen to teachers. They listen to witnesses. And the only time they're going to listen to a teacher is if that teacher is first a witness. So the difference is like you can teach about a subject kind of from like a, at arm's length. Here's this subject. A witness is to say like, this is how this is actually happening in my life, right? And for a teacher to teach the faith, for parents to hand on the faith and proclaim the gospel is to say, this is how Christ has met me, changed me, is changing me, and this is the hope that I have for you too. And it's always a proposal. It's never something that has to be forced.
Invitation.
But it's an invitation. Yeah, it's something that's real.
Oh, that's wonderful. Actually, that is good enough. That is good enough to end on, actually. That was good. I'm glad you remembered that. And actually, before we close here, though, you want to just plug your podcast or how someone might be able to find you, you and Father Shane's podcast, or if they have any questions and want to badger you with email or something, how do they find you?
No, absolutely. Yeah, badger me with email. I don't need any more of those. We do have this podcast called Outcast Catholic. It's on everywhere you find your favorite podcasts, they all say. We do have an email on there too, outcastcatholic@gmail.com. We're always open to people sharing their feedback, not just about, oh, you're doing a great job, but like, what are things that would be helpful to talk about that are actually affecting your life? We're always open to those kind of topic requests. Those are always helpful. As the vocation director of the Diocese of Sioux City, we have a cool vocations website. It's called SC Sioux City Priest. It's not SC. SC Diocese is my email. SiouxCityPriest.org. SiouxCityPriest.org. There's kind of a fun news feed that keeps up with some of the seminarians, keeps up with some of my work around the diocese. There's profiles, biographies, and videos of each of our seminarians on there talking about their own vocational discernment, their own journey. And there's some other kind of resources for men considering a vocation to the priesthood. The Vocations office also hosts some fun stuff over the summer. Yeah. We do a trip we're doing it to the Black Hills this year. It's just kind of a masculine holiness excursion for young men in high school and in college. It's called the Quest trip. This year we're going to the Black Hills. We're hiking a mountain together, praying together, spending time together. That's not just for men discerning priesthood, but some of our seminarians come, a brother priest is coming. And then every summer in August, so that's in June, then every summer in August we have a discernment retreat that we usually host in Okoboji called Quo Vadis. Yep. Where are you going? So those are some spots you can find me. Yeah. So
awesome.
That's in Vocations website and then our podcast there.
Oh, thanks so much. Would you like to close us off in prayer, maybe on behalf of all those listening and maybe any intention that you might have?
Yeah, of course, Aaron. Thank you. And thanks for all your good work. Thanks to Father Feller in this good mission that's happening right now. Thanks to all of you who are listening, who have a real desire to keep growing in the life of the faith. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, everywhere present and filling all things, treasury of blessing and giver of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all stain and save our souls, O gracious Lord. And Heavenly Father, do send your Holy Spirit upon each of us to stir up in us the gift of our baptism. We might become leaven within our families, within our communities, within our culture, within the world, that we might continue to proclaim Christ crucified, risen from the dead, and reigning now among us. I ask you to especially bless our families with a growth in the faith, a growth in their ability to proclaim the gospel every day in their lives, to stir up in our families vocations to holy married life, vocations to the priesthood, vocations to religious life, that we might see the building up of your kingdom here in our diocese, here throughout the Midwest, in our country, and the world. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Catholic Passage Podcast, and we hope that it blesses you. Please check out our show notes for a reflection takeaway, as well as more info on Catholic Passage. We aim to support parents and educators as they pass on the Catholic faith and way of life to their children and students. To find out more about what we offer, or how you might collaborate with us, visit CatholicPassage.com. Most importantly, you can support us through your prayers. We'll be praying for you. Please pray for us.